Romans Part 3, Lesson 6. And this week, again, last week we started into chapter studies. This week we also did a chapter study. And what chapter are we on this week? 10. So this section, Part 3, is focusing on chapters 9, 10, and 11, right? And what subject are we discussing? Sovereignty, right. So, and as we always lay out the sovereignty of God, we want to lay right beside it what? Responsibility of man, sometimes called the free will. But we're going to look at those two today again. But we can't look at one without remembering to keep the balance, to understand the other as well. And this week, last week we looked at chapter 9. We backed up a little bit into 8 because really the subject of sovereignty of God is everywhere, but it was really introduced in starting in 8, but it's focused on a lot in 9, 10, and 11. So this week, as we look at chapter 10, we're going to back up a little bit into chapter 9 as well. And there's, as I got ready for this, there's several different ways that we could look at this. But there were just like two main things that I thought that were just really important for us to focus on. And as we are looking at that, the two subjects that you looked at this week, in general, in huge terms, are what is focused on in chapter 10?
Israel did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God.
Okay, so you're absolutely right, and that's a huge part, but it's Israel, and what did they do? So what happened with Israel? So that's one of the things we're going to
follow the law.
Right. What happened with Israel is one of the subjects we're going to look at, and the other main subject in this chapter is what? Salvation. So how does someone get saved? Okay, so these are the two questions. And actually we can just divide the board right down the middle because that's what we're going to be looking at today. So the specifics of what you were saying, Judy, are absolutely true. And we're going to go through starting in chapter 9, verse 30, and we're just going to list what did Israel do, what did they not do, what happened, okay? And you had something like this in your lesson, in your exercises, we can list exactly, this is one of those times where we're going to go verse by verse. And we're just going to see what does it say. We don't have to suppose. We don't have to necessarily even go all over Scripture and look up old stories that help us understand it. We're just going to see what it says. So starting in chapter 9, in verse 30, remember Paul's method throughout the book of Romans. What is that? Questions and answers. He asks a question, and that question usually comes from whatever he has just been saying. So it's almost like, well, not almost, it is exactly like, as he goes through and explains something, he realizes it's going to raise a question. And so he asks the question, he preemptively asks the question, and then he answers it in the short answer, and then he answers it in a longer explanation. Okay, so in chapter 9, verse 30, we start with a question, right? What is that?
What shall we say then?
What shall we say then? Now you would have to go back and look at what it's saying in chapter 9, and it's talking about God calling the Gentiles and only a remnant of the Jews. And then righteousness is by faith is what is talked about in this part of this paragraph, essentially, starting in verse 30. So he's asking the question, what shall we say then? The Gentiles, what does it say about the Gentiles?
They pursued righteousness by faith.
Well, first it says they didn't pursue righteousness at all.
No.
They weren't pursuing righteousness. Okay, when God puts different people into categories, it's Jew and Gentile, right? So he's saying of the Gentiles, they weren't pursuing righteousness. Could you say that about yourself? When you were unsaved. There's none righteous, no, not one. We're not seeking after God. Now, your story may be similar to my story, which is that I went to church. So I had a familiarity with God. I had a comfort level with God. I was not fighting against it most of the time. I was a rule follower, so that's not true of everyone that goes to church, but that was my story. And so even as a Gentile or unbeliever, I'm a Gentile anyway, but even as an unbeliever, as a churchgoer, I still wasn't really pursuing righteousness because I was doing things my way. I was very comfortable with the way I was doing things. That would be more like parallel with the Jews. But it says with the Gentiles, they were not pursuing righteousness, and yet they attained righteousness, even a righteousness by faith. Okay? But Israel, here it's talking about Israel, there's a contrast. What was true of Israel?
They pursued a law of righteousness, but not by faith. They did not pursue it by faith.
And if the part about not by faith hadn't been added, we could get confused and think they were pursuing righteousness. And we might leave the law out. They were pursuing a law of righteousness, but they didn't arrive at that law. That's the other thing. They were pursuing it, but they didn't arrive. At that law of righteousness. They didn't arrive at it. Why? It says in verse 32. Why? What's the answer?
They did it as though they were by works.
Right. So they didn't do it by faith. That's one of the things. They did not do it by faith. They were trying to do it by works. That was their attempt, is to do it by works. And then it says what else? What else happened as a result of all this? I heard it.
They stumbled.
Stumbled over what? They stumbled over the stumbling stone. Now, somebody asked last week, or in the rock of offense it says, what is the stumbling stone? We talked about it last week, but the answer is right here. If you were wondering, it says, they stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written. It's written in Isaiah 28:16 and Isaiah 8:14. Just as is written, behold, I, and this is God, Jehovah speaking, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And he who believes in him will not be disappointed. So, who is the stumbling stone?
Jesus.
Yes. So they stumbled over Jesus. It's been talking about a law of righteousness. That seems to be the problem, and it is the problem. They were pursuing righteousness by seemingly pursuing righteousness. They thought they were pursuing righteousness, but they were pursuing a law of righteousness. They were pursuing it by works, but not by faith. They stumbled over the rock of offense. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, which is Jesus. Right? Now, moving right into chapter 10, it says, Paul's expressing his heart. He said, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. So what is that indicating about Israel?
They don't have it.
Right. Right. They're not saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. So what do we know about them? Right, they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. And I heard somebody, I think it was Cindy back there saying, I'm going to just say not by the Word of God. They weren't studying the Word. Now, in a sense, they were studying the Word, they thought, but again, they missed a very significant part. They missed the very significant, they missed the important part. But they did have a zeal for God. Let's not miss that. They had a zeal for God. Some, at least. They had what we would call religion. A lot of times in our terminology today, they had religion, they had their practices, they had the showy parts. And have you ever noticed in your own life, or if you're watching someone else, that they may have a zeal for God, you know, that they may be that person that's there every time the doors of the church open. And they may really seem to, but when you really talk to them, they're counting on that for something. Have you ever had the question? I remember right before I got saved, I remember somebody, an evangelist probably, giving a message and saying, if you died right now and you went to heaven and you stood at the gates, and whoever you want to come to those gates, I mean, you know, there's always that imagery, but let's say this actually happens this way. Paul, Peter, whoever comes to the gates and asks you, why should I let you in? What would your answer be? And I remember sitting there thinking, you know, there's got to be a right answer. There's got to be a right answer. What's the right answer? What's the right answer? I've asked that a couple of times, not thinking that it would work, and it can be a very effective tool when you're talking to somebody, because a lot will start, well, I guess I'm not going to ask y'all, somewhat rhetorical, but a lot will start saying, well, I go to church, I was baptized at a certain age, I did this, I did that, you know, whatever, this was done to me. There's a list. And that would be up there with the way the Jews were looking at things. They were circumcised as a baby. They didn't have anything to do with that. If it's a male, that is. They were taken to synagogue. They were taken to, in our case, church. They had their bat mitzvah or their bar mitzvah. They learned the Torah, memorized it. You know, all of these things. They were the keepers of the law. They had the law. They were keeping it and practicing it. And we have those parallels in Christianity. My parents had me christened. I went through a class at 12 years old-ish. I graduated from that, actually. I guess I was less than 12 because I moved back here when I was 11, and I went through that class before. It's usually around the age of 12. So I joined the church by taking that class. You could go forward, you could be baptized, you could be on a roll somewhere. You could, any of the things that we list as our credentials, in essence. Are those what gets you into heaven? No. So if that would be your list on this side of heaven and this side of death, if that would be your list, you're not going. You're not going to heaven.
Right.
So that's a little daunting to say. That's a little difficult to hear. But you're not going if that's your list, because that's not what gets you there. If those things are true of you, that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying if that's what you're counting on, that's not what will get you there. And my fear and my concern is that 90-something% of the people sitting in churches, that is what they're counting on. Something on those lists are what they're counting on. So let's go forward. They had a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge, for not knowing about what? What were they doing in verse 3?
They sought to establish their own. They
Yes.
did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God.
Okay. They sought to establish their own what? Righteousness. And then what was the other part? Sorry, I forgot it after I've got that up there. They did not. So this is what they did do and what they did not do. They did not subject themselves to God's righteousness. So that's the do and the don't. And that's the key. That's what Judy said at the very beginning. That is one of the biggest parts to this whole section is what did they do? They had a zeal for God, and they were seeking to establish their own righteousness. This takes us back all the way to Genesis, where you have Cain and you have Abel bringing a sacrifice to God. And when we're reading the story, both of their sacrifices, in my opinion, were acceptable, but not in God's. We don't always understand exactly why one was not acceptable and the other one was. There's things that people say, but bottom line is, God said, that's not acceptable to me. And Cain got angry, and he killed Abel. And, which is, shows his heart. God even said about his countenance, why is your countenance fallen? If you do right, your countenance will be lifted up. If you just do the right thing. So, it's really, it's a very simple story, but this goes all the way back to that. Cain came according to Cain's way. That's the thing to learn about that story. Cain came, not that what he did necessarily was wrong. Because if you go to the law that came thousands of years later, you see that in the sacrificial system, there were grain offerings. Cain's was an offering from what his job was, which was to tend the produce. Abel's was flocks. And so he brought sacrifice. They both brought sacrifices. So they seem both to be acceptable. For whatever reason, God says this wasn't. And it was probably more about he's coming on his own. Maybe God had even said, bring this. And he goes, well, I'm going to bring what I want to bring. Later, if you look at the book of Malachi, you see God fussing at them because they were bringing their animal sacrifices, but they were bringing the spotted ones and the weak ones and the damaged ones, because you can imagine their mentality. It kind of says this, but their mentality was, that's trash anyway. I wouldn't want to breed that one anyway. So I'm giving God what I don't want anyway. I'm not going to give him what I do want to keep for myself.
Not giving the best.
Not giving the best. Fast forward from Cain to Abraham, and God said, sacrifice your son, your only son. And he had another son, but this is your child of promise. There was a statement made to me as a young Christian that just really pierced me, and that was the idea that when I'm looking at God, this is unfortunately a really bad representation of God. But if I'm looking at God, or actually I should just say, that's God, this is me, and I bring something between me and God that I'm focusing on more than I'm focusing on him. And the easiest one for me to think about is my children. And as moms, what did we do? We focused a lot of time and attention on our children. And maybe still do, grandchildren maybe now, but we still focus on that a lot, to the detriment of our relationship with God. If we truly are his, he's going to take that out of the way so that we are clear. Do you really want that? Do you really want God to have to take your children out of the way? Or whatever you've placed there that has value to you? Don't put it there. Put it in its rightful place. God first, and everything else will be ordered correctly. He's not saying, well, actually he does say, unless you hate your father and mother, and it's a comparative thing. He doesn't really want us to go around hating them. So, moving on. They were trying to establish their own righteousness, and they did not, in the process, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. In verse 4 it says, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Now this word end, by the way, is more like, because when I first read it this way in the English, I would think it means that Christ put an end to the law of righteousness. But what this is saying is more like a means to an end. We have that phrase in our society, a means to an end. So what would I say that end is? A goal. Okay, so put that word back in. As Christ is the goal of the law of righteousness to everyone who believes. Not the end, meaning he puts an end to it. But in a sense, when you reach your goal, you've reached that end. That ends things, right? So, and then it says in verse 5, for Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on law shall live by that righteousness. Okay? So one of the things that they were doing, because Moses told them to, is they were trying to live by the law of righteousness. But it doesn't say it exactly this way, but it says, for Moses writes that those who practice righteousness based on the law shall live by that righteousness. Or I said the law of righteousness, I should say the righteousness based on the law, if you want to write it exactly the way it is said here. The problem is that law doesn't bring life. What does that law bring? Death. Because if you don't practice the law perfectly, exactly, never failing it, you have failed the law and you die. Okay, so you can't live by that law. But if you're trying to live by that law, you better live by that law. Every part of your life, all the time, every aspect, never, ever, ever, ever failing. Yeah.
It doesn't happen.
I'm sorry, what?
It doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen, and it wears you out thinking about it, doesn't it? Right? So can you imagine the life that is lived this way is a life built in fear and concern and worry and legalism, no fun? I mean, is that the abundant life that Jesus told us that He wanted us to have? No. No. And that's the goal is Christ. The stumbling block was Christ. That's what we need to be focused on. So move on. And it says, but the righteousness based on faith speaks thus. Okay, so now we have, the difference is, I'm going to rewrite this because it's going to bug me. They live by the righteousness based on law. Now here's a contrast, sorry, I'm putting like a geometry symbol of but you have the righteousness based on faith. This is the contrast.
Shouldn't it be on the other side?
What, the symbol?
No. Based on faith, shouldn't that be on the other side? Because that's how you get saved.
Yes, I'm just saying, but I'm just making a contrast here. You're right. This should be over here. I didn't understand what you were saying. Yes.
Yeah. And verse 4 too, I think, should be here. At the end of the law.
Okay. Then I'm going to say goal or end of the law of righteousness. You're right. Sorry, I had missed putting that over there. But yes, those parts will be part of how does one get saved. And in these next two verses, 6 and 7, it says, but the righteousness based on faith speaks this way, speaks thus. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Who will descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. Was that confusing?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. Made you think, didn't it? Okay, let me read verse 8 and then we'll go back just for a second. It says, but what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching. So if you're trying to ascend to heaven to bring Christ down, or you're trying to go to the abyss to bring Christ up, the next verse says, the word is near. You don't have to go to heaven, if you could, to bring him down. You don't have to go to the deepest parts of wherever to bring him up. The word of faith is near. Okay, so that's what it's saying in 6 and 7. You know, you don't, when it's saying, do not say in your heart, who will, what it's saying is, you don't bother with that. Don't bother with that. You don't have to reach great places and attain that and go get him. It says in verse 8, the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching. So, the word of faith is near. In mouth and in heart. And it's being preached. And just for a second, I'm just going to tell you the word preach. The word preached is the word from evangelism. I mean, sometimes we use the word preacher meaning our pastor of our church. You know, that, I don't hear it as much, but we used to say it a lot. And it would say, preacher, you know, this, that. But a preacher is technically, and I'm not saying we're wrong to call him that, it's just a title. And hopefully your pastor is an evangelist. Hopefully the preaching. But when it's talking about preaching, it's specifically talking about preaching the gospel. It's talking about evangelism. It's not talking about the teaching of equipping the saints for the work of service, which doesn't have to be separate. I'm just saying, so preaching, where does preaching primarily happen? Outside the church. We're trying to reach the world. Now, that doesn't mean that the gospel should never be spoken in church, because it should always be there, because you always have to assume whatever group of people you have, there's unsaved people there. But let's just say everyone in here, you know, we go, if every week you came here, and every week I spelled out the gospel, and the next week I spelled out the gospel, and the next week I spelled out the gospel. I mean, the gospel's awesome, but there'd be a point where you're going, I'm saved. I need to know how to live today. I'm saved, and I like being reminded of that. We all need to be reminded of the point of our salvation, of what we were like before, and all of that. But if that's the only message you ever get, then you're not going to continue to walk and grow and become more and more like Jesus. So evangelism, pure evangelism, the preaching of the gospel primarily should be done outside the church and not by your pastor only. It should be done by you. It can be lived in your life. Now, I am not a spiritually gifted evangelist. That's one thing I've learned about myself. I am not a spiritually gifted evangelist, and I mean that specifically. There are spiritual gifts. Evangelism is not, but I am told I am to do the work of an evangelist. We're all to do that. Just like I don't have the gift of mercy, but I'm told to be merciful to people. So we can watch someone who does have that spiritual gift. We can go along with them. We can become part of a program, possibly, if it's done well. And we can learn how to do the work of an evangelist, and we all should be. We should take every opportunity we have. 2 Timothy tells us, in season and out of season. When it's convenient, when it's not convenient. Preach the word. Preach. Evangelize. Preach the word. So this word of faith is preached. That's evangelism. It's near. You don't have to go and grasp for it in some far place. You don't have to climb mountain, whatever it is, to see some guru up there. You don't have to build a tower like the Tower of Babylon to reach the heavens. You don't have to dig a hole and try to find the abyss and find Christ. He's near. He's near. Because I'm going to jump just a little bit. If you jump down to verse, sorry, let me see if I can find it. 17. It says faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. So this is also the word of Christ. And it says, I'm just going to go ahead and write it. Faith comes by hearing. And what are we hearing? We're hearing this word of Christ. Okay?
Well, verse 9 says it too.
Yes. Verse 9, and I just wanted to stop for just a second on these verses. Number 1, verse 9 and 10 are part of what we call the Roman road. If you've got the Roman road underlined and referenced in your Bible, verse 10 and the next one would be verse 13. But it says in verse 9 what? What is it? What does it spell out that we are to do?
Confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord,
Okay.
and believe in your heart that He was raised from the dead.
Jesus as Lord, and believe in your heart God raised him from, hang on a second, I'm going to separate these out just a little bit. And I'm going to kind of insert verse 10 in here. What is the result of confessing Jesus as Lord with your mouth?
Salvation.
Right. What is the result of believing in your heart?
Righteousness.
Okay, now I separated those out, kind of inserted the information back in because it restates the information. But I also want to point out this, mouth and heart are also right there. If you go back to 8, you see, the word is near, right? In your heart and in your mouth. Then it says, what are you supposed to do with that mouth and what are you supposed to do with that heart? You're supposed to confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, which results in salvation. You're supposed to believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, which results in righteousness. Okay? Then it moves on and it says, for Scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be disappointed, which is awesome. Can't even imagine. But we will not be put to shame is another way. It's not just your feelings. You won't be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. For the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in the riches for all who call upon him. So here we have a problem. I mean, here's the thing. Call upon him. What does call reference back to?
Believe.
It referenced back to this confession, right? That we have to do with our mouths. And before we go any further, if you can't speak, you're not going to not get salvation. Because number one, you could sign. But I'm just saying, for the rest of us, we need to be saying it out loud. Okay? Then it goes on and says, for whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, this is call upon him. This is Jesus. This is call upon the Lord, which is Yehovah. I love it when God has it so that we know it's both. They're the same. Jesus is Yehovah. I love it when that's there. Because that is an Old Testament quote. And if you went back to Joel 2:32, that would be all caps Lord, not capital L, little O-R-D that you looked up this week. Okay, so we both have to say Jesus is Lord, and we have to call upon the name of Yehovah. It's two different names, two different meanings. Same God, just two different things. And then it says in verse 14, but how shall they call upon him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him whom they've not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? So there's a path here. Let's kind of back up. You got to have a preacher so they can hear, so they can believe, right? And again, we're not talking about your pastor. We're not talking about one person with all the responsibility. How shall they preach unless they're sent? So we've got to put sent up here. We'll put it over here. And that makes you think of missionaries, doesn't it? Right? But do you have to leave the country in order to be, no. You have to leave your house, maybe. And sometimes they come to you. It might be a worker that comes to your house.
Or in your own house.
I'm sorry?
Or in your own house.
Yes, yes. It could be family. It could be your spouse. It could be, yeah, you're right. And that is our primary number one mission field that God has given us. How shall they preach unless they're sent, just as they're written? How beautiful are the feet of those who bring glad tidings of good things. That's a great way of putting the gospel. However, they didn't all heed the glad tidings, for Isaiah says, the Lord who has believed our report. Okay, so over here we can put, they didn't heed. Right? They didn't heed. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. But I love this too. I put word of Jesus, or no, where did I put it? Word of Christ. Okay, that means Messiah. We know that to be Jesus. But where would Messiah have been preached long before Jesus ever came in his earthly ministry? During the times of the Old Testament. Messiah was being preached. They had the idea of looking forward to the Christ, or the Messiah coming, the anointed one coming. So,
in Isaiah.
yes, yes. And that's an awesome place, again, to go and see the prophecies and to see what, the specifics of his birth. That's awesome to know, but what was the point of the whole thing? He was going to come, and he was going to die, and he was going to come again. All of that is in the Old Testament, all of it. And then it says, so faith comes from hearing. So there's a real important thing here about we've got to confess with our mouths, we've got to believe also, but we've got to hear. Is it enough to hear with your ears? We've also got to heed. Remember when we did Revelation, that it said, he who hears and heeds in the first part? And we noticed there's a difference. Over and over and over, the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, and it says, they'll have ears, but they will not hear. Okay, so I'm not going to ask the question, I'm going to let Paul ask the question. But I say, verse 18, surely they've never heard, have they? Indeed they have. Their voice has gone out, this is a quote from Psalms 19:4. It says, their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. But I say, surely Israel did not know, did they? Okay, remember back here, it said, without knowledge, and it said, they have a zeal that's not according to knowledge. Over and over, it kept talking about know and knowledge. Okay, so what they were doing was not that they were ignorant and had never heard anything. It's that what they were doing was not based, like Sandy said, they weren't studying the Word. They might have heard it, they might have been taught it, but they weren't heeding it. They weren't seeing what it really said. And it says, at the first, Moses says, I will make you jealous by that which is not a nation. By a nation without understanding will I anger you. And Isaiah is very bold and says, I was found by those who sought me not. I became manifest to those who did not ask for me. Who would that be? Gentiles. Right. So, what it said over here when it was saying they were pursuing, well, actually going back to chapter 9, what we saw, the Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, but they attained it, and they attained it by faith. While the Jews were trying to attain righteousness through a law, through works, and they missed it. They stumbled. They missed it. And we're talking in the generic form. Let them out. It says, but as for Israel, he says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to what?
Disobedient.
Okay, so God, all day long, stretched out his hand. But they are disobedient and obstinate. Okay. So when you think about everything that's up here, and we're going to stop and talk about it for a minute, you see that this is what Israel did. This is what's true of Israel. And bottom line is, they're obstinate and they're disobedient. What would they be disobedient to?
Anything that wasn't the law, right? The law.
Right, the law specifically. But more than anything else, for them to be on this side and not on this side, because over here we're talking about salvation. If they were disobedient to the gospel that was taught about Jesus, about the Christ, about the Messiah.
They didn't take his hand.
Right. Hand was reached out. Remember in Hebrews? He grabbed onto us. I love that. And we just grab back. Otherwise, we're just flailing around and causing ourselves problems.
He still holds on.
He still holds on no matter what because he's faithful. I love that. But he reached out, stretched out his hand all day long Do they have an excuse? No, there's no excuse. They pursued a law of righteousness according to works. Now, I can get a little bit and give them this. There's confusion. I can understand the confusion. You know, God gave them the law. God gave them the temple service. He gave them this way of doing things. So it's not really talking about that they followed and did that. That's not what it's talking about when it says they're pursuing righteousness by a law of righteousness or by works. It's saying that they're doing it their way. And they had, you know, what happened is that we've got the Torah, which I think is enough. I mean, there's a lot written in there. If you start studying Genesis through Deuteronomy, a lot of rules, a lot of law, a lot of things written in there. Why would you add to that? But they did. They multiplied rules and just massive volumes of rules to follow. How many steps you could take on the Sabbath. You know, and Jesus came and he's like, he takes the grains of wheat and eats them as he goes, and he's faulted. Jesus is faulted. He doesn't do the ceremonial washing like they were doing, and he was faulted. He did work on the Sabbath, meaning he healed people on the Sabbath.
He ate with sinners.
He ate with sinners. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, all these things, and especially when you talk about the things he did on the Sabbath that really tweaked their noses. Because they, you know, and Jesus would say something very practical. If you had an ox that fell in a ditch, wouldn't you pull him out? Yeah, sure you would. Right. But wouldn't that be considered work? Are you going to leave that ox to die? No. I mean, and if you care about an ox, why should he not care about a person? You know, where Jesus is healing people. So they got themselves bound up in a lot of rules and regulations, but they were pursuing righteousness their way. That's called iniquity, and it's called transgression. These are all terms that we've heard and we see in Scripture that pertain to sin. You've heard me talk about this a little bit. Iniquity is your bent, your twistedness. And so when I do something in my own power, in my bent, then I am doing it in iniquity. I'm doing it not the way God would do it, because it would be straight and perfect if he did it.
They said to live one way, but they lived an opposite way.
That's the other. The leaders were holding others to a higher standard than they were holding themselves. They were putting burden after burden after burden on someone that nobody could bear, while, you know, they had money and they were leaders and they felt so much better and higher. You're right. So they did all of that. But they were as they were pursuing this law of righteousness, they weren't doing it by faith. They were doing it by their own works. They didn't arrive even at that law. That's transgression. Transgression is, you know, this is the standard of God. I might try a couple of times and realize I can't get there, so I'm going to lower the standard and say I can get here. This is going to be my law. This is going to be my law of righteousness. This is going to, and when I get over that, man, aren't I hot stuff, right? And I've made it, and I'm whatever. You know, they did that, but we can do that. We can do that too. We can say it's good enough, or I don't know how many times I have people say, basically, I'm going to do whatever the behavior is. I'm going to do whatever, and God will forgive me. You know, God would want me to be happy, right? So I'm going to live however, and I'm not under law, I'm under grace. So I get to live however I want to live. But that's not. When it says Christ was the goal or the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes, you got to figure out, when you went through and looked up and wrote down your list on faith, I hope you added every time you saw the word believe. Because that is the verb for the noun. It's the same word, essentially. So let's just go through. In verse 30, it says, even the righteousness which is by faith. That's what the Gentiles found, even though they weren't pursuing it. Verse 32, because they did not pursue it by faith, that's talking about the Jews, but as though it were by works, they stumbled over the stumbling stone. And then in verse 33, it says, he who believes in him will not be disappointed. Remember, we had the disappointed elsewhere over here, where it says in verse 11, whoever believes in him will not be disappointed. It's the same phrase. Will not be ashamed or found lacking, put to shame. So but that believing in Jesus. And then it goes on and it says, don't let him in, just leave him alone. Christ is the end, or Christ is the goal for the law of righteousness to everyone who believes. In other words, you can attain to a law of righteousness if it is a law of righteousness by faith. Because there is an end goal to that, and that's Christ himself. Christ is the end of that. Christ is the goal of that. And then it says, verse 6, but the righteousness based on faith says you don't have to go to heaven, you don't have to go to the abyss, because the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith, which we're preaching. So you've got the word of faith, that is the gospel. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe, that's the verb, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart man believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses. Verse 11, whoever believes in him will not be disappointed. In verse 14, they call upon him in whom they cannot call upon him in whom they have not believed. And how shall they believe in him whom they've not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they're sent? So basically go backwards. The gospel, people that are giving the gospel are going to be sent out. By the way, if you've never had a formal ceremony where somebody's laid hands on you and anointed you in any way, with words or with oils or with anything else, and commissioned you to go out into the world, does that mean that you don't have that commission?
No.
Right. You don't have to be formally sent. So don't take that verse to mean that. Every person that has what you have, you give away, right? So I cannot give the gospel to somebody if I don't have the gospel. I have the gospel, not just a track, not just a wonderful way of, a speech. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about I have a testimony. I have my own salvation experience, and I have the learning I've gotten since then to understand it even better. And that's what I'm going to talk to somebody about. Because if I'm going by somebody else's script, it's going to be stilted, it's going to be disjointed, it's not going to feel like it's coming from me. Although if it is straight from the Word of God, there's power in that alone. It's not in me anyway. But I am sent. Just make sure you know that. You are sent. You are to preach. Maybe it'll only hit their ears. It's not up to you. But they will hear, hopefully heed, which leads to believing. And then when they believe, they confess with their mouth, and that they've believed in their heart. Results in salvation, results in righteousness. It's important. And they do need to do that. Again, if you got the thief on the cross, he did not have to get down and get baptized to go to heaven. He just spoke out to Jesus, and Jesus said, today, you will be with me. Where were both of them going? Ultimately, literally death. They were going to leave that earthly body, and that day, that man would be with Jesus in paradise. Not the other one. And then it says, what do you have to do? You have to confess with your mouth, Jesus is Lord. You looked up Lord this week. What did you find? Till the last day.
Lord, Master, Owner,
Okay.
Jehovah.
Okay. It's when it's translated in the Old Testament, it's Jehovah, right? So it's Lord, Master. What else did you say? Owner. Okay.
To
Yeah,
give
I could
authority.
do Adonai.
Adonai. Yes, that's the
Master.
yes, Master. What is okay? So we've got Master, Sovereign is one I saw. Supreme Ruler is another. Jehovah, that's the supreme ruler of the universe. Okay, so this is what Lord means. We don't in America anymore have slavery. Around the world they understand slavery. Best we have right now here in America is maybe a boss, right? And here in America, we're so independent. We don't necessarily always do what we're supposed to do, even if our boss tells us
We
so.
want to do it our way.
Right, we want to do things our way. So it's not the greatest picture. But if you truly were, against your will, owned by someone, do you have a choice if they tell you what to do? No. You do it, right?
Or else.
Or else. Right. You're right. There is, like, we can be obstinate and disobedient, and there is an or else. Okay. As a Christian, if I've confessed with my mouth, we're not just giving Jesus a title and saying, I have said out loud these words. In other words, if I wrote it on a piece of paper and handed it to somebody and they read those words, does that save them?
No.
No. So this is the idea of out loud saying with your mouth, you are assenting to, He is Lord over me. And notice it says there's no distinction between Jews and Greeks, for the same Lord is Lord of all. I'm not declaring Him Lord. I'm not putting Him in a position. I'm only acknowledging what's true. I don't make Him Lord. And really, I don't make Him Lord of my life. We use these phrases sometimes. I don't make Him Lord. He is Lord. All I'm doing is, if I'm doing this correctly, is I'm saying, I subject myself. Remember where it said they did not subject themselves, Jews did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God? Here it's saying, I am saying out loud, I subject myself. I am His servant. I am a bondservant. Bondslave is another phrase to it. You know, the picture of the bondslave was after they had served their period of time that they sold themselves into slavery. Then they loved their master so much they wanted to stay, and so that the awl would be driven through their ear to mark them, and that they would, anybody that would see it would say, oh, you're owned by somebody. You have voluntarily put yourself into service for that person for life. That's the picture. You have voluntarily, with your mouth, said, He is my Lord. So when He has ways and He says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, you're acknowledging He does command. And if you're doing that, do you live your life any way you want to live? No. When you hear these people and you watch them living their lives, and I can fall prey to bad things too, but that's not what should characterize me. That's not what should characterize any Christian. Any person claiming to be a Christian, if they're living their lives apart from the ways, word, and ideas, rules, commandments of God, they are not subjecting themselves to Him as Lord. They're saying to Him, I'm going to do it my way. And they're over here. They're obstinate and they're disobedient. It's real chilling, isn't it? A lot of times as we're presenting the gospel, we might, if we use this, we might take somebody to this and they can go, okay, I can call Jesus Lord. I don't have a problem with that. That's not what it's talking about.
It's not just words.
It's not just words. Not just words. The next part is you must believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead. You remember the heart is an organ, right? We're not talking about literally inside your heart something happening. We're talking about the seat of your emotions. The soul of who you are. So at that point, at that centered point of the essence of who you are saying, I believe, which engages your mind, I believe that God raised Him from the dead. Why is that significant? We're coming up on that season, right? April 1st will be the day that we celebrate this year, Jesus raising from the dead. And everybody in here is looking forward to that. Everybody in here acknowledges that, not just the April 1st part, but it happens to fall in our calendar that everybody acknowledges it. That's our hope, right? We're excited about that, right? Y'all are like, okay, you're about to ask me a question and I don't know the answer. Okay, why is it significant for us to believe in our heart that God raised Him from the dead?
Because without that, there'd be no hope.
Absolutely.
The
What?
gospel is
That is the gospel, yes. The death, burial, and resurrection of Christ is the gospel, and the appearance to many afterwards.
Well, we can't live without our hearts, so we can't live without God.
There you go. That's a great one. We can't live without our hearts. It is a vital organ. And he says in that place, we can't live, in that soul live, we can't live that spirit life with God without that. That's another great thought, yes. We've got to believe there, in the core of who we are, that God raised him from the dead, because it is our hope. It was the proof that when Jesus died, and a lot of people have died for causes, still do. There's a lot of martyrs out there that die for causes and stay dead. The resurrection proved that even though Jesus did die a physical death, that he was perfect, sinless, and was raised after. That's our hope. And we will be raised at some point. We will be resurrected as well. That first fruits is our hope that there's a harvest to follow, and we're going to be part of that harvest. It's the idea of trusting. If God can do that, he can do anything. Right? And that changed everything, didn't it? It changed everything for the world, but it changed everything for me and in me. Can I be the same person after? No. Can I continue in those old patterns of sin? No. With those two things, with believing in your heart that God raised him from the dead, I'm changed forever. And confessing with my mouth, saying, he is my Lord, I'm going to follow him. I will do exactly as he would do. I cannot be the same person. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people that think they're on this side of the board. There's churches filled with them.
It's not that easy.
It's not that easy. Actually, it's super, super easy, because really it all comes down to just doing this, but it's so hard because that's so profound. You know, I used to say to teens, if I knew perfect Russian, and I picked Russian because I'm thinking, who learns Russian, right? There's a few that do. But in our school systems, it's rarely offered. But if I knew perfect Russian, and I mean perfect in the sense that somebody in Russia would not know that I am not a native. I speak it, the inflection's perfect, the pronunciation's perfect, etc. Okay, and my grammar is perfect too, right? If I knew that as well as English, and let's say I wrote out this document, and just to be sure, I handed it to a few experts in Russian to make sure that my terminology is correct, that my lettering is correct, because they have weird lettering too, and my grammar is correct, and the message is correct. So you can be assured that this document that I'm going to hand you, y'all can't read this, so I'm going to show it to you. This way it's not in Russian, but as if this is in Russian. Okay. And then I came to you, and I taught you how to say the words. I didn't tell you the meaning. I just taught you how to say the words. With perfect inflection, with perfect pronunciation, no mistakes, and we went over it and over it and over it, and if you did stumble, I corrected you so that you could restate it. And I handed this to you, and you read that in perfect Russian. And then I told you later, that is confessing Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart. That is the perfect gospel presentation, and you just acknowledge Jesus as Lord of your life. Would that save you? No. Because you had no understanding of the words you gave. That's no different than if I would parrot and somebody would parrot it back, or say something and somebody parroted it back to me in a prayer, that saves them. It has to be a change in them. But it also says, how can they believe unless they've heard? How can they heard unless a preacher said it? And how can a preacher say it unless he's been sent? And by the way, you're that preacher. So, but we also have to throw in their heed, because did Israel hear?
They did.
Yes. And they didn't heed, but they did hear. There is no doubt. God stretched his hand out to them all day long. He gave them the word. He gave Moses to them and Moses' writings to them. He gave them prophet after prophet after prophet that they killed. Did they hear? Yeah, they heard. They're in the land. Is that a witness? Yes. Did they have the temple? Yes. And every part, you know, that all the parts of the temple, tabernacle, then temple, all point to Christ. Every one of them. And it's written, as Judy was saying in Isaiah, but in other places, it's written throughout the Old Testament. Isaiah is just rich with it. If that was the only book they had, the message is there. The Messiah is coming. He's going to die. He's going to be raised. He's going to come again. That's the part that still hadn't happened that we're waiting on. That's told to us in the New Testament as well. The New Testament tells us about him coming. They were looking forward to it. We can look back on it. But we, a lot of times in church, are pursuing a law of righteousness or pursuing a law of righteousness on our own, by our definition. And all you have to do is listen to people. And you hear, I can live however I want. Who are you to judge me? You can't tell me what to do. That's not the God I want to believe in. They're over here. Breaks my heart, and we'll keep pursuing them. But we can't put them over here because we want them here. We can't put them over here, and as I've said many times, I can love someone and want so badly for them to be in salvation. I can really want that for them. But that doesn't get them there. I can't but at the same time, I can't like them and want them to like me so much I won't give them this message. To tell them those differences. If nothing else, Jesus isn't Lord of your life if you're living your life however you want to live it. So this part can't be true of you. You can't have really believed that God raised Jesus from the dead, because what the criteria of Jesus dying was is he was perfect. And he died for your sin. And by dying, by taking that on, he died to the effects of sin on you, if you believe him, if you're his. And the proof of that is God raised him from the dead. That's why it's so significant that they have to believe that in their hearts. They may believe it on a surface level. Oh yeah, I've heard about that. Let me go get my chocolate eggs and let me go do an Easter egg hunt and let me focus on a bunny. And then I'll dress up with my nice little white patent shoes and, sorry, that was throwback to my childhood. First day I get to wear my white patent shoes and cute little dress. You know, that's what Easter was for me, with no significance to the greatest event that ever happened, and will ever happen. It's not enough just to go to church and listen to the wonderful music on Easter. Sorry, I'd rather call it Resurrection Sunday, but it's not enough. You have to change your life. You don't change it to get to salvation. It's after salvation you are completely changed. That's the resulting in righteousness part. Where did it go? This part. Salvation results in righteousness. Remember, prior to salvation, I can't be righteous. There's no part of me that is. There is no righteous, none righteous, no, not one. After salvation, I have been declared righteous by God. Now I can live that. It's in me. It can come out of me. I can live it. And will, if this is true of me. But if your life is lived in such a way that you are not practicing God's ways and practicing righteousness, you aren't saved. It really is that simple. And it's not for me to say you're a bad person. It's for me to say, I want for you to have eternal life. I want for you to understand the difference. I love you that much, even if it makes you mad at me. And it will, for a lot of people, make them mad at you. I care more about their soul than I care about them liking me. That's the bottom line for me. It's hard, though. There's a lot of people, I don't want them stumbling over me, but they stumble over Jesus. There is a critical point. We can't get past it. We can't make it something that it's not. Was there any question or anything else that as I just looked at this lesson, I thought it really boils down to those two things. What happened to Israel, which is true of the church today in America. It's a parallel picture. But how does one get saved? What makes the difference? And it's so simple, and yet profoundly hard, but it is so simple. And we can walk somebody through it. We cannot bypass sin. We cannot bypass unrighteousness. We cannot bypass and just say, they've heard it, I took them to church, they've heard it, I've told them the gospel, whatever. They have to heed it. And there's no excuse, bottom line, through all of this, not just of Israel, but of us, especially the church in America. There's no excuse. There's no excuse, period, if you look at the book of Romans, because God gave us this to look, and He gave us a consciousness of Him within us. What does a zeal for God do for you, though? It can temporarily satisfy that God hole in us. We're pursuing it, makes us feel good about ourselves. But it's kind of like, and I'm going to use one of my faults, it's kind of like eating a bunch of dessert. It can fill my stomach for a little bit. It certainly satisfies my tongue because I love sweets. I love sweets. But if that's all I ate, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to get sick. It's not just fat. I'm going to get sick. I'm going to get a headache, actually. It's one of the first things that would happen is I get that sugar headache, sugar rush headache. But if that's all I ever did, it's going to fill my belly. There might even be some, and I usually use the picture of our niece as a young girl, was so picky at eating and wouldn't eat, and it was a fight at the table all the time. And honestly, if they'd really understood, and I didn't know, that seriously, in the palm of your hand, that's all a child needs to eat in a day. If you could understand that, you wouldn't panic. You know, you want them to eat, we pile their plates, and we try to put good food on there. But she would, after the turmoil and everything, they'd make her sit forever and everything else. Finally, they would relent, which only taught her just to hang on as long as it took. She'd get down from the chair, I'd look over eventually, and she'd be sitting on the floor of the kitchen with a big as her lap bowl of potato chips. And I noticed it, and her mom looked at me and said, at least she's eating. Okay, I use that all the time because that's what Christianity tends to be today. At least they're going to church. At least they are, whatever, fill in the blank. They say they're a Christian, but there's no substance to it. And it'll give them a sugar rush headache. I can have a zeal for God as an unsaved person. I did. I went to church. I served in my youth group. I was one of the officers in my youth group. I went to church as an unsaved adult and went to Sunday school. Knew more answers than anybody in Sunday school. I mean, I'm good at that in my own flesh. I'm good at that. But I wasn't saved. I had to get saved. I had to see that difference, and God was faithful to have someone tell me, and I heeded it. That was the difference. I'd heard it, now I heeded it, and it changed everything. Everything. It did change everything kind of right away, but God still had to bring things to my attention. Well, what about this? Oh yeah, especially if it was being taught from the Word. Yeah, I need to get rid of that too. Yeah, I need to get rid of that too. And not because I was trying to get some law of righteousness. It's because I have the end goal of righteousness, Christ, and I'm living it out in my life. So if there's someone, or if there's something in your life, but if there's someone that you know that claims to be on this side of the board, and yet their life does not show that and does not prove that, then they have not acknowledged and subjected themselves to Jesus as their master, owner, person who can tell them what to do, and we can't tell him no if we're doing what's right. We can't tell him no. If he truly is Lord. No, he is Lord if we're subjecting ourselves to that. And if we really believe God raised him from the dead, then we understand why he died. We understand the significance of that. We understand what that resurrection meant, and we understand that resurrection power is in us. So I can't say, well, it's just me. I just can't change. It's just too hard. God understands me. God made me this way. Love that one. God made me this way. Really? God doesn't make bad stuff. Okay, we're gonna stop. We're gonna do our meal and the video. Very, very significant. We've got 2 more lessons. We're looking at chapters 10 and 11 and concluding this part on the sovereignty of God. Because understand, on this board, you've got the sovereignty of God and you've got the responsibility of man. Not just over there, but you have it. God has stretched out his hand. He is sovereign and he does that. What did they do? They were disobedient and obstinate. He has told them. He has given them the word. Every question Paul asks, he doesn't ask a lot in this chapter, but every question he asks is, surely they haven't heard. Yeah, they did. They just didn't heed. Well, surely there weren't enough preachers. They killed them all. Every time God sent one, they killed him. So there is no excuse. That's what needs to be written. There is no excuse, and there's one way to be saved. It's by faith, not by works. Again, we don't come to righteousness and clean ourselves up and bring it to God and say, look, I'm worthy. We come, he finds us. He calls us. But then we call upon him. We confess him with our mouth. It's in our mouth and our heart. The word is near. We didn't have to go searching for it. How did the Gentiles get it? They attained it not by searching for it. They attained it by faith. That means God came in a form probably of a person, but God came and I don't mean that, I mean that he spoke through a person, sorry. God came to a person in that moment, called them, gave them the message and the ability to understand it and believe it. God does all of that, but our responsibility is to believe it. Our responsibility is to confess it. Our responsibility is to then live it out. No excuse. No excuse. Very plainly put. And I love it.